I've talked, of course, before about the private military company, and that is dependent on how you see it, either a substitute or a complement to a military in the sector of defence. Now, if we look at the other side of the coin, the dichotomy I talked about in the other video, the other side of our physical cyber security, we see security and policing. We see the equivalent to the PMC within national defence, as it were, within policing, which is private security. Now, this doesn't quite conjure up the same image, does it? When I say private military, people think of either Blackwater, or they think of megalomaniacal evil firms with super soldiers dressed in black from some sort of Bond film. Yet, when I say private security, you probably don't picture the same thing. Maybe I'm odd, but I picture probably some sort of 6'5", rather hench bald man outside a nightclub, who gives you the nod after checking your ID. Well, it's a pretty stark contrast, but private security on a higher scale is not our bold bouncer, but something rather a lot more, and actually something rather a lot more controversial, actually something which is probably debated just as much as the PMC. Now, this more falls into two categories really, and of course it depends upon the nation, because certain things will be allowed, certain things won't, basically. And obviously it's not quite as extreme as PMCs would see abroad, but it has more breadth than people think. The first category is the idea of private police. Now, they're commissioned officers hired by a non-government body. This could be a university, a non-nuclear power station. It could be an office building, that sort of thing. And the second category is that of the private security guard. Now, both of these concepts are actually somewhat controversial, surprisingly, to my surprise as well, actually. The former, the idea of the private police officer, is a controversial topic because it lacks specificity. The question is, what are the role of these police officers? Now, I've mentioned again that these people are commissioned. They might be doing it, sort of in off hours, times they're not on duty. But the question arises, if let's say there is a private police force on a campus of university, what is their jurisdiction? If they're hired by the university, do they have legal powers over anyone who is not a member of the university itself? Well, that's a pretty difficult question to answer. It's described really as an anachronism in the abilities private police officers can have, because they still do have some powers through being commissioned. Can the university arrest members of the public? What can they carry as private police officers? Now, these private officers are of huge value. They really do benefit society, but there is still a grey area in how they operate, what force they can use, what jurisdiction they have. And that's one that's really difficult to answer on the legal and practical basis, because it's so commonplace, and really often there is the proper interaction with local non-hired police and constabularies and locations and that sort of thing. There is a link. So a lot of people do claim that they are basically just off-duty police working more police shifts, and it doesn't, burden the taxpayer. There are a number of apparent advantages to this in using legitimate policemen in their off hours, commissioned officers who can operate as private security. First off, they can do things that security guards can't do, since they have additional powers granted by the state, including the power to arrest. And of course, they are sort of allowed by the government, by the police force, to actually operate, to be a private police force. Now, they also have the same privileges as officers, since they are commissioned. The state regulates the private police. The private police officers are held to a way higher standard than security guards perhaps are. And the cost of the private police is shifted onto the organisation utilising the police officers, not to taxpayers. And that's really quite important, because it means you can have an area that is well protected, well defended, meaning that police don't have to utilise their resources there. They can put resources elsewhere, money, equipment, men, rather than having to put a huge amount of focus into these areas which are already protected, which are already privately policed. And that's more efficient for the taxpayer, and the police force has more security and can protect everyone else in society to a greater degree, Also, they can engage in mutual assistance agreements, allowing them to work together. It's a very sort of synergized thing, which can work really, really quite well, and often they specialize. So let's take the example of the university. Police might be trained to deal specifically with students, faculty, dangers commonplace to university campuses, the actual university campus itself, and they know it inside and out, which makes them more effective, and it means that the area is actually safer because they're not having to do other duties as an ordinary police officer would if they're operating for the government. Now, the second, I talked about the fact there were two categories. The first is more legitimate but still controversial. The second is that of the security guard. Now, this poses a very different argument. For people guarding larger sites, private areas, warehouses, what can they do? In the UK, it's pretty uncommon to find these sorts of security officers, security guards who aren't police trained. It's very unlikely to find security guards who aren't former police officers or even current police officers, are private police. They're nearly entirely commissioned at some point, but it does raise the question in places like the US, where this isn't such a commonplace thing, where security guards employed may be able to own a gun. Sorry for this. They may be able to own a gun. They may be able to have other equipment that people in the UK might not be able to have. They might have more rights to use that equipment. They might not even have any formal or even informal training. So the question is, are they legitimate operators? Can they be trusted to operate? And what right do they have to operate? If it's this person's property, in the US, I believe, then he can, do what he wants dependent on where it is. But if it's not his property and he's guarding someone else's property, what authority does he have? Can that person dictate authority to him? I don't know. But it makes a controversial argument. Are they allowed to detain people within vehicles despite not having the same immunities, protections, and powers of the police? Are they allowed to move in a manner that puts themselves and others at risk, as the police might, in catching someone if they have no police rights and protections? It's a difficult question. Nonetheless, there are a lot of people who argue for this. In the UK, at least, historically speaking, the police are rather new, only fully and properly organised in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, of course. And before that, there was actually little organisation. In the UK prior to 1750 with Fielding, or even before His Majesty King George II, the UK had a system of privately employed thief-takers and watchmen, founded upon similar concepts to basically that which were claimed in the invention of the modern PMC under Stirling. This stuff was commonplace in the past, and private security was, of course, allowed, because that is how you would protect your property. And the question is, in a situation where perhaps property needs protection, that police can't dedicate that much time to it, is there a situation where security guards can be trusted? Is that a good thing? Now, there are benefits, of course, to private security guards. Many argue that because they're cheaper, that might have a benefit. Simply, if they're responsible, and they would be, in providing a proper service, because it's in their best interest to keep, their employer happy, to keep on retainer, to keep the area safe. Employers are happy and employees are happy. It's cheap. Areas are protected. The security guards are paid, and everyone seems to get on well. In the UK, as well, of course, there isn't as much force being used. Should it be allowed to a higher degree? Because mainly it's a deterrent measure. It's utilising security technology, cameras and stuff, security patrols. It's for intimidation generally, rather than actual forceful prevention and protection. It's, spotting and deterring. Now, this being said, it's slightly concerning that this has been quite a bit associated with the anarcho-capitalist thought, which wants to see more of this, which wants to see, obviously, everything fully privatised. So the question is, should we follow the commonplace private security guard with the line of logic that we're ignoring the proper role of the police? Does that reduce the role? Does it reduce the gravitas that we give the police? Should we leave it to the professionals? And, if you're not anarcho-capitalist, you probably believe that we should have police. And I absolutely agree. So does it devalue the idea of the police? Now, of course, there are many apparent disadvantages as well. Namely, it has potential to be regressive as well. So the poor might not be able to afford private security services, although on the other side of the coin, it can also free up police forces to operate more within poorer areas that aren't... Basically, it allows the police to frequent poorer areas more often, and that means that they can provide more protection, and that's a good thing. But does that mean that there's now an inequality in coverage even by the police of the rich and of the poor because the rich people have more protection? I mean, who knows? But regardless, the main question is what right do private citizens or non-police officers have? Even what rights do private police have? When actually looking at what scenario they can operate in, and the degree to which powers carry over, the degree to which they have to be introspective within their specific environment. And that's actually hugely, hugely important. And I don't think we want anyone going down the anarcho-capitalist rabbit hole. So, nonetheless, does it devalue the police? I don't particularly know. Are there benefits? Yes. Are there disadvantages? Absolutely. But it is actually existent, and people often don't consider it as much. They don't consider it as controversial as the PMC. It's not, but it certainly is worth discussion, I think. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I've butchered that somewhat.